The name Boudica conjures up a range of associations, but most often we perhaps think of a flame-haired warrior standing up to the might of Rome. Freedom fighter, warrior queen, Celtic icon, she's perhaps all of these things and more. But the length of time between her lifetime and the general lack of primary evidence about her means she's become subject to a whole range of legends. Many of these legends concern the site of her final battle with the Romans and her subsequent burial place. And in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore, we're going to take a look at who the records say Boudica was and examine these legends around her grave. Who knows? Maybe we'll get a little closer to her in the process. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are into 2022, which is amazing. And we are also coming up to the third birthday of Fabulous Folklore, and it's hard to believe that something that I kind of started just to make my blog posts more accessible has then become this podcast and has reached a lot more people than I think my blog ever did. So if you have been listening from the beginning, thank you. If you've just discovered the podcast and you're going back to the beginning to work your way through, enjoy. And yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed this kind of stuff that I've been putting out there into the world. So this week we are starting with our new theme for January, which is all about legends associated with actual real people who existed. So I don't really want to cover someone like Robin Hood because there's still some debate about who he actually was. Whereas with these figures that I've chosen, like they are actually in the historical record, but they've then also accrued all of these legends and myths and so on about them as well. So that's kind of the defining factor. We will no doubt come back to the myths and legends of more mythical people at some point later on in 2022. But I'm going to start off with Boudica, mainly because the fact that this was the one that was actually requested by a listener. And as always, if you'd like to drop a request, there is a link to a Google form in the show notes and you can just hop on there and put your request in. And if it's something that I can cover, then I will. And also if it's something that I haven't done before, then I'll cover it. But that's why we're starting with Boudica first. And Boudica is probably one of those huge towering figures whose shadow really does stretch quite far across a lot of the more mythic side, I think, of Britain in particular. And it's quite interesting because of the fact that we actually know comparatively little about her. And I think that in and of itself is kind of why we've got these myths and legends about her in the first place. So we're going to start off by having a little bit of a look at who she was and then have a look at some of the legends, particularly around her gravesite. So who is she? Well, put simply, Boudica was the wife of Tacitus, who was the ruler of the Iceni people in East Anglia. Her name is often given as Boudica, spelt Boudicca, although Boudica spelt with one C is the more accepted version. If you've seen it written down as Boudica, then that is the Latinized version that was bestowed by the Romans. Incidentally, some people do think that Boudica actually translates as victory, which is an interesting thing to know. Now, the Romans conquered southern England, including East Anglia, in AD 43, and they initially allowed Tacitus to continue ruling his people as he had done before. And this was because the Romans sometimes allowed local leaders to rule their kingdoms as client states of Rome. And this meant that the leaders could more or less rule as they had before, as long as their leader lived, and they did what Rome commanded them to do when necessary. When Tacitus died in AD 60, the Romans then took over because that was what they had ultimately agreed with him. The problem was, Tacitus had actually left his kingdom to his two daughters and Emperor Nero in his will. So he seemed to want to try and balance both sides, but of course obviously the Romans didn't see it that way and they seized control of what they saw as being their legal property. It was worth doing so because the Iceni were a wealthy group and the Romans essentially went around confiscating property. Now, according to legend, they actually stripped and flogged Boudica and raped her daughters, and I say according to legend because one of the accounts that we're going to have a look at mentions the events, but the other one doesn't. So it's one of those things where we're not quite sure why that was included, if it was true, or if it was removed by the second account in order to try and preserve the reputation of the Romans. Now, after this happened, the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus took his campaign to North Wales in either AD 60 or 61, and Boudica took the opportunity to rebel, and she raised her army among the Iceni and the Trinovantes, another tribe, and they defeated the Roman 9th Legion and razed Colchester, which was the then capital of the country. They also went on to destroy London and Verulamium, which is now known as St Albans, and there are quite a lot of commentators who will discuss the irony perhaps of having a statue to Boudica on Westminster Bridge in London after she destroyed it, but there we go. Eventually, Paulinus returned from Anglesey, and rather than waiting for reinforcements, he decided he was going to take the battle to Boudica because he got to choose the battleground, and obviously he's far more experienced in matters of warfare and so on. Obviously the Roman army machine has been well documented, so I'm not going to go into it here. And ultimately, Paulinus managed to defeat Boudica. Interestingly, he's believed to only have had around 10,000 men at his disposal, compared to the 230,000 warriors believed to be in Boudica's army. But essentially, the Romans destroyed the Iceni uprising, and Boudica disappeared from history, for a while at least. Now, we do have to remember that at the point that the Iceni revolted, they were actually considered Roman allies, and that's basically because they'd managed to largely keep to themselves and keep separate from the empire. There wasn't actually a Roman centre in East Anglia, and the archaeological evidence does seem to suggest there was much more of a tendency towards Iron Age living during the period in the area. The Iceni also used their own coins, and because they didn't really import goods, they weren't drawn into the social, political and commercial worlds of the Romans. Now, Caitlin S. Gillespie does point out that if Boudica had bowed to Roman pressure and adopted a Roman lifestyle, she may have been treated differently by history. So put simply, if she'd behaved as the Romans expected a woman to behave, they would have praised her role as a wife, as a mother, as a domestic caretaker essentially. But she didn't. And this is where we have to turn to the two accounts of her written by the Romans, and they're written by Tacitus and Cassius Dio. Now, we do have to remember that Tacitus was only 5 or 6 when the revolt happened, and his father-in-law Agricola actually served in Britain during the revolt. We don't know if Agricola was actually there at the final battle, but even if he was, it's highly unlikely that anyone captured Boudica's words verbatim. So therefore, the report that Tacitus gives of her speech to her troops kind of remains open to contestation. However, at least Tacitus was writing in the same period of time, roughly, as Boudica. Cassius Dio, by comparison, was writing about her some 170 years after the revolt, so he's even less likely to have had access to first-hand accounts, and his report of the revolt is even more likely to be heavily influenced by speculation. The two authors don't agree on major points, they provide different reasons for the revolt, and then when they do agree on other elements, it's still difficult to know which, if either, is more likely to be accurate. So we're going to start off with Tacitus, and he paints Boudica as a fine speaker, rallying her troops before the final battle, and according to her, the way that he describes her speech, she thought they were fighting for justice on behalf of all of those who'd been assaulted by the Romans. And obviously here she does have personal things to resent for the Romans. And she even claims that the gods will help them to win, which is a fairly standard thing to put in a potentially victory speech. Now, Tacitus then claims that after the battle, which obviously doesn't go in her favour, she committed suicide to avoid being taken prisoner, and he actually paints her as being quite courageous here, choosing death over being taken captive. And if this was indeed what happened, bearing in mind that this would be the Roman way of doing things, her desire to avoid capture was totally understandable. And Caratacus actually led an earlier revolt against the invasion of 43-47 AD, and after his final defeat, he was actually paraded through Rome in AD 50 as part of a mock triumphal parade, and he was only spared anything further thanks to his quite quick thinking and appeal to the Emperor's clemency. Clearly, Boudica is attempting to avoid something similar, or indeed worse, considering the treatment she'd apparently already suffered at the hands of the Romans. Now, by comparison, Cassius Dio focuses on Boudica's warriorness, and this actually comes directly from what he said. In stature, she was very tall, in appearance most terrifying, in the glance of her eye most fierce, and her voice was harsh. A great mass of the tawniest hair fell to her hips, around her neck was a large golden necklace, and she wore a tunic of diverse colours, over which a thick mantle was fastened with a brooch. This was her invariable attire. She now grasped a spear to aid her in terrifying all beholders. So in her speech to the troops, after he's described how she looks, Boudica considers the Romans to be oppressive, too weak to handle the British weather and terrain, and she also criticises the unequal division of Roman society along gender-based lines, which doesn't necessarily appear to have been the case among her people. Now, Dior also described Boudica's use of divination before the final battle, and according to his version, she released a hair from the folds of her cloak, which ran off as expected, and it ran off on what they considered to be the auspicious side. And at this point, Boudica apparently thanked Andraste, who was supposed to be the Iceni goddess of war, for what was believed to be an impending success. In his writing, Dior also refers to a goddess Andante, who had her own grove, and he says that this was their name for victory. So it's not really sure if Andraste is a goddess of war and Andante is a goddess of victory, or if they are indeed one and the same. But it does appear that this figure, particularly Andante, is syncretized with the Roman victory goddess Victoria. But interestingly, Boudica is here performing a type of augury, and and I find this even more interesting because the Romans used birds in the same way. So an augur would release a bird and watch the flight pattern to decide if it was flying to the good side or the bad side. And Boudica is essentially using the same process, albeit using a hare rather than a bird. So I did think that was quite cool to find the same kind of divination. Now for Dior, Boudica actually ends up with a proper ending, as it were. So Tacitus claims that she committed suicide, but then she just disappears from the account. Whereas in Dior's, Boudica is given a magnificent burial befitting her honour and status. And he says, and I quote, "Boudica fell sick and died. The Britons mourned her deeply and gave her a costly burial, but feeling that now at last they were really defeated, they scattered to their homes," end quote. Now the problem is our body was never found, and no one knows where the final battle took place because neither of them actually bothered to give this particularly important piece of information in their accounts. And sites along Watling Street in the West Midlands have been put forward, including one site in Warwickshire. And as a result, because the site of the final battle is unknown, her burial site is also unknown, and Dior doesn't tell us where this costly burial took place. Now, historian Edmund Bolton actually wrote the first account of the rebellion since Tacitus in 1624, and in it he even claims that Stonehenge was a memorial for Boudica, which is a bit of a reach. But there we go, that's obviously they didn't understand the difference between the Neolithic and the Iron Age back in 1624. But it does just show that people have essentially been making things up for quite a few centuries now. So where is Boudica buried? Well, some people think that she was buried on Hampstead Heath, which does explain the fact that there is a Boudica's mound on the heath. Now, no digs have ever unearthed anything of note here, and there isn't actually any evidence that it was really used as a grave. Other people have even suggested that she was buried on Peckham Rye in London, and in 1905 a councillor even imagined the Rye itself as the site of their final battle. And as picturesque as this all sounds, experts have pointed out that crossing the Thames at the time would have been difficult. There's another legend in which Boudica is buried on Stanmore Convent in London, which is another location believed to have been the site of her final battle. Now, other sites have been given for her burial place, including 2 sites near Waltham Abbey and also Bartlow Hills in Essex. And a lot of these come from the 1937 work of folklorist Lewis Spence. And the problem with Spence is he resolutely ignored actual archaeology in the face of unspecified traditions. Essex has several claims to Boudica, and various sites including Stock and Messing are proposed as sites for the final battle, but then there's also a belief that she poisoned herself near the Iron Age earthwork of Amesbury Banks in Essex, where it's believed that her ghost still wanders. And if we haven't got enough of ghostly Boudica, her ghostly chariot has also been seen near Cameringham in Lincolnshire. How anyone knew it was Boudica, we're not sure, but that is indeed what the legend says. There's also a large mound on Garboldisham Heath in Norfolk that has been known as Boadicea's grave since the 1850s, and scholars did think that this mound was a little bit more of a likely location because they think her headquarters may have been somewhere near Thetford, almost 8 miles away, so that one does seem to at least fit the locations involved a little bit better. But the problem is that so-called traditions about the location of her grave certainly date to the 18th and 19th centuries due to Boudica's growing popularity, and as Jennifer Westwood points out, they're not actually indicative of real folk memories of her true burial place. They're just these traditions of, oh, there's a mound, there's a barrow, it must be Boudica's. And this brings us to the strangest of all of them, and this is the King's Cross connection, in which she's allegedly buried under platform 10 of King's Cross Station. And this idea, while imaginative, has a bit of a bizarre set of origins. So, First of all, an elephant and a flint axe head were discovered in a gravel pit on Gray's Inn Road, which is right next to King's Cross. And in 1715, John Bagford published a theory that the Romans had brought the elephant to Britain and that the flint was actually part of a British spear. Then we move a little bit further on, we get to 1811, and John Nelson publishes his History of Islington, in which he repeats the theory that Battle Bridge in Islington was so named as the site of the Roman Iceni battle. The remains of a Roman encampment in the area apparently provided evidence that the theory was true. As it was, at the time there was a narrow valley between Pentonville and Gray's Inn Road that Nelson believed would have been ideal for the Romans. The narrowness of the valley meant that it funneled the attacking army, destroying Boudica's advantage of having more warriors, and this does indeed fit with Tacitus's description of how the battle unfolded. Now, Battle Bridge then gained a new name in 1830, which was King's Cross, and while Nelson never actually cited the area as Boudica's final resting place, his evidence, and I am using that with air quotes, along with Bagford's, appeared to provide confirmation as to the site of the battle. And then this is when the next twist in the tale arrives, because if this was the site of Boudica's final battle, then surely it stood to reason that she'd been buried in the area. At least that's how the theory ran. And according to the King's Cross legend, Boudica was buried under Platform 10. Now, this story appeared to first emerge during the Second World War, and while I was having a look into this, a guy named John Clark had done some discussions of this as part of conference papers and so on, and he said that he couldn't find any mention of the burial under King's Cross before the 1970s. Now, I went looking this morning on British newspaper archives, and I found a mention of the legend in a 1952 edition of the Evening Express from 14th of October, and then there was also a book review in a 1951 issue of Truth, and an author named Robert Colville had actually related the legend in his book, London, the Northern Reaches. So if these two mentions come from 1951 and 1952, this would suggest that the Second World War origins of the legend may indeed be correct. And I must admit, as much as I could find on BNA, bearing in mind it's not an entire archive at this point because they're still digitising issues, I couldn't find anything before 1951. So while there are things before the 70s, there doesn't seem to be anything before the Second World War at least. But here's the biggest problem. None of this is actually true, because the Roman encampment turned out to be medieval, so completely the wrong time period. The flint spearhead was actually a Neolithic axe head, and the elephant was also a creature from the Neolithic period as well, so none of them were the correct time period. And John Nelson had supposed that Battle Bridge was so named for Boudica, but he doesn't tell us who supposed this. And there was actually a history of Islington written some 20 years earlier by the Reverend Daniel Lyson, and he made no reference to this fact, and you would think that's a fairly large thing that you would mention. So it seems that John Nelson almost seems to have been the one who supposed this link between the two. But John Clark does point out that Battle Bridge only gained that name in the 16th century, having previously been known as both Bradford Bridge and Batford Bridge. So it seems that battle became a derivation of those words rather than referencing an actual battle. And there is a possibility that the legend of the burial under the platform originally started as a joke, because Platform 10 is where the trains to places like Cambridge and East Anglia start, which then links with Boudica's origins in East Anglia. So here it's possible that the joke became so often repeated that it ultimately became a legend, and perhaps it gained popularity during the war through Boudica's role as a warrior, intent on freedom for her people. So what can we make of these myths? Well, it is worth pointing out that no one actually knew who Boudica was until the 14th century, when historians rediscovered the work of Tacitus. After that, she occasionally popped up in literature between the early 16th century and 1780. And then it's then in 1780 that Thomas Cowper wrote a poem about Boudica known as Boadicea and Ode, which included prophecies of Britain's future that apparently came from Druids, and it was at this point that Boudica's popularity exploded. And this is the point at which various places began laying claim to Boudica, both for being the site of her final battle and for being the site of her grave. And here the claims really do appear to be based more on wishful thinking than actual evidence. And I can absolutely see the King's Cross legend being a joke that ultimately became a legend through repetition. So it's still worth knowing for that while it's not true, where it came from in and of itself has become a legend as well. And finally, one of the big problems with Boudica is that we see her as this revolutionary figure. But what you've got to remember is ultimately her revolt changed nothing. Yes, she razed these 3 cities and she did kind of show the Romans that you could beat them. But if anything, it actually made life for other Britons worse. So she didn't really do that much to help her own cause. And because we know comparatively little about her from British sources, it's quite easy to then use her to make whatever points we want to make. So as Gillespie notes, she's, and I quote, being held up as an imperial icon, guardian of national identity and champion of women, end quote. And she's often brought up in discussions about feminism, which isn't really fair because you're then projecting 20th and 21st century ideologies back into AD 60, which sort of doesn't really make sense. Female leaders from Elizabeth I right through to Margaret Thatcher, and also weirdly even Theresa May, have been compared with Boudica, or they've tried to compare themselves to Boudica, Elizabeth I in particular, but also Queen Victoria were quite fond of making these comparisons with Boudica. The Queen Victoria one makes no sense considering the fact that Boudica was attempting to stand up to an empire. Why on earth would she then be a fan of Victoria, who was expanding an empire? But anyway, because the only actual historical sources about Boudica come from Tacitus and Dior, they've then basically coloured their portrayal with their own Roman sensibilities and in some cases almost used Boudica's speech to her troops to put forward their own feelings about the Roman Empire. And obviously, more importantly, neither of them were actually there, so there are no eyewitness accounts of what actually happened. And as I say, it is all too easy to project your contemporary feelings backwards into the 1st century. So, as an example, when I mentioned before Elizabeth I and Victoria, they both claim some kind of weird spiritual alliance with Boudica because they were kind of relatively unconventional monarchs that approached the business of ruling differently to male monarchs. But King James I, on the other hand, totally uninterested in Boudica, and she fell out of favour during his reign. So ultimately, when different places and people try to claim a connection with Boudica, we really do need to ask the question, why? Which part of her myth are they attempting to resurrect? Are they trying to align themselves with a legendary warrior who fought against oppression and the empire mentality? Or are they trying to use nationhood and this idea of freedom for a more sinister agenda? And this is unfortunately one of the problems with folklore and myth and legends. They do get perverted to be used to support things that the original person would probably never have supported ever. But they're not here to stop anyone. So that is something that we do need to be aware of. We do need to have a big hearty dose of discernment when we look at stories like these. Now, ultimately, unless more work is done, we'd never really know where the final battle took place, although we do have some good contenders. And even if we found a grave, we've got no way of knowing that it is actually Boudica's unless someone actually managed to put something in there that would identify the occupant of the grave as being such. And we obviously can't do DNA testing or anything. So it's one of those things. We'll probably never find where she was buried, but she has become this huge figure in British history for the fact that she basically stood up against the Romans and completely annihilated 3 of their settlements, which obviously a lot of people overlook the butchery and the carnage that ensued from that, you know, she was murdering people. But obviously she did so, in her view, in order to get back at the Romans for the way that they had behaved against the people who already lived in Britain when the Romans invaded. So it is obviously quite a complicated story. It is quite a nuanced one, but I do find it quite interesting that people have this legend about Boudica and where she might be buried, but she hasn't become like a king in the mountain figure like we've covered before, like Francis Drake or Arthur, who will return if the country is in peril. Nobody seems to be going looking for Boudica to be like, can we borrow you? We need a hand. So I think that's quite interesting that she remains in legend rather than being a legend that we can necessarily bring back. I'd love to know what you think though. What do you think of Boudica? Have you been to any of the apparent grave sites or battle sites? If you have, please do let me know. You can comment on the blog post and the link for that is in the show notes, or obviously you can just tweet me or whatever and that would be brilliant. And yes, I hope you enjoyed that. We are going to have a look at different figures throughout this month. I'm not quite sure which order I'm going to do them in because it depends basically what research I can find. But we are going to have a look at Dick Whittington next week because there is quite a lot about him. And obviously he has his own pantomime, which is something that we've not actually looked at yet on Fabulous Folklore. So that should be quite interesting. But other than that, I'll let you go and do whatever it was that you were doing before you started listening to this. I hope you have a marvellous day. I hope you have a marvellous week ahead. And I will see you next week for more Fabulous Folklore. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.